I'm gonna give you 12 of the best old school strength hacks from one of the greatest books that you have never read, and we're gonna start right now. Okay, right off the bat, old school hack number 1, the biggest thing that we can do in our training, especially if we are training by ourselves, is to lift out of a power rack. Now, what does that mean? Let's say we're at Gold's Gym, or let's say we're at any public gym and we want to actually squat. They're going to have the pins set, right? So that it's a safety issue, right? One thing that we can do is we can move those pins around. Okay, so using a power rack is something that's going to increase the safety of training, especially again if we are training by ourselves. But the second big factor here with training in a power rack is that now we can find specific sticking points in our lifts and we can train from those sticking points. Okay, so envision those pins. Okay, let's pretend that you get stuck in a squat halfway up. You can now put the bar on the pins at that sticking point and start from that point that is where you struggle. Okay, that can lead to greater execution of the movement because your body learns how to recruit high threshold motor units at that sticking point. Okay, you can do this at the top range, you can do it at the bottom range. We used to call those rock bottom squats, and you can do it in the mid range. The next thing that you can do is also doing that with presses. You can do that with pulls. Okay, so you can put it right at your knee and it's a really hard spot to start a deadlift. You can do it, if you get stuck mid range on a bench press, you can move the bench in there and you can start at that sticking point. If you get stuck off the chest, you can use that power rack and use those pins to go from that point. The other aspect here, okay, and I believe that this is something that's very similar to how we see single leg squats at Garage Strength, is that when you're training out of a power rack and you're training from those pins in different positions, you learn tension in a better manner at those sticking points. Okay, so what that means is that when you're getting set of a place that is hard to execute a movement pattern, you can now start to increase the tension there and your body becomes more familiar with the tension needed to be successful through that range that you usually suck at. Okay, so now all of a sudden we're looking at 3 reasons why we need to use a power rack. 1, it's for safety. 2, it's for increasing the method or increasing those sticking points or getting rid of those sticking points. And that third big factor, it's gonna teach us better tension and better coordination. And that's gonna lead us into this next big discussion that I love from this old school training method. And this is gonna give us the concept around isometrics and isometronics. Okay, so let's think about isometrics. If we see an athlete, let's say that they're pushing up against a wall, they're pretending that they're in a drive phase, they have their knee extended, they have their hip extended, they're in plantar flexion, they can hold that position in a hip lock as they're pushing into the wall. That's an isometric, that's a form of an isometric, and they might hold that for 20 seconds. They're trying to strengthen their ankle joint, their hip extension, their knee extension, and their plantar flexion. That is a form of an isometric. Let's just pitch that as a clear method. Another one, and we've talked about this with the heel unsupported single leg squats. This is a form of an isometric. This is something that we have used to increase athletes' vertical jump. Okay, we've seen a lot of direct correlation between single leg squats and vertical jump, and if we have somebody who has some ankle issues, we go heel unsupported. That's where we're seeing an isometric. Now they have to hold that position for an extended period in that isometric hold. Okay, so that's a very clear understanding of isometrics. And this is something that this old school book right here brought up quite a bit, is how do we use these isometrics? And then they progressed into something that I use very, very heavily, and I've experimented with this quite a bit. And a lot of the isometric stuff I experimented with ton from around 2007 to 2012, using isomaxes is what I would call them, under the influence of Jay Schroeder and what I had learned and what I had watched with what he did with Adam Archuleta in the early 2000s. But then I sort of took this a step further. I had been told about this book from Charles Poliquin. He's like, this is one of the greatest books ever written on strength and conditioning. There's a couple things, I read it, I'm like, I'm gonna test this stuff out for years, literally years, okay? And this next thing, so we go isometrics, then the next aspect would be known as an isometronic, okay? So think about what we just talked about with the power rack and coming out of those different positions, okay? So what I wanna paint for you here, and we can provide this B-roll, is that we have someone like Haley Reichert, world bronze medalist, okay? And she's coming out of the bottom squat position, doing those rock bottom squats, but she's coming off of the squat rack, the squat pins that we're using from that bottom position. This is going to strengthen the tension out of that bottom position, which in turn will lead to a better pull for her in the clean, a better pull for her in the snatch, and it will strengthen her squat. We use this, is known old school, it's not scientific, but this is an old school term, that isometronic is how it was termed. Okay, so now all of a sudden you have this isometric action, and then as your body starts to recruit more high threshold motor units, you start to get successful through that concentric movement. And the cool part here is that you can see this with your own eyes. You can see an athlete push, if they're doing, let's say, really heavy quarter squats, you can see them push into the bar might bend, and they're pushing, and as they're pushing, their body, their muscle spindles are signaling to their brain like, hey, we got to recruit more. And now the body learns how to execute that concentric movement faster. So each rep starts to get quicker, and in turn they increase their rate of force development. Okay, so that's a method known as an isometronic. So we're taking that old school isometric, now we're getting to the old school isometronic. And then finally, the third piece here is going to be using high speed isos, okay? So this would be, you hit a jerk and you pause in the split. You hit a jump and you pause in the landing. You hit a dumbbell snatch into a hip lock and you pause there. But you're doing these things at high speed. So in the case of a weightlifter or even a power lifter, let's say a power lifter might drop at a rapid eccentric and then they pause in the bottom and then they drive back up. That is a rapid isometric. It's a dynamic isometric. It's high speed. So your body's learning how to coordinate at very, very high speed. So those are three hacks out of that isometrics, the isometronics, the high speed isos. Three awesome methods that you can learn directly from this book to improve your overall understanding of isometrics, and you can apply that today. That's stuff that we're doing inside of Peak Strength. All of the training knowledge, all of the books we've read, all of the information, the studies, the research around everything that we've done here on site at Garage Strength is applied in our strength training app, Peak Strength. So if you guys need to improve your performance on the field, out in the court, on the wrestling mat, in the pool, download Peak Strength at peakstrength.app, the Google Play Store or the Apple iOS Store. Now, the next thing, another big comprehension here is going to be based around comprehension of volume. And this is one of those abstract discussions that everybody sort of gets into, is like, well, what even is volume? You know, should we count if we're doing partial range of motion? Should we count if we have bands on or jumps, or if we do like one leg over the other? Like, what is volume? What does that even mean? And I think the thing that we need to realize is there's nuance. There's certainly nuance, but we can engage with the nuance and make it simple. And that's the one thing that these old school books do, is they bring it back to the simplicity of training. I'm gonna take this directly out of this book, that know that training volume is the amount of useful weight that we lift for sets and reps. And typically in most systems, that's gonna look like 65% of a 1 rep max or more. Now, most of the work will be done between 75 and 80%, maybe a little bit more, but usable, effective volume begins at 65% or higher. And that means when you're warming up, it doesn't count as volume work. That's okay. It's okay, guys. We can acknowledge that when we're trying to understand how much volume we're getting in one phase over the other. It also means that if we're doing work, let's say partial work out of a power rack with an isometronic and it's really, really heavy, we understand what that volume is. We understand the phase. We understand the tool that we're using. Let's say quarter partial range of motion back squats with high volume or with low volume with high intensity. We can see what that does to our body, and then that's how we understand how much volume we should do in that phase when we're doing a partial range of motion movement. Okay, so I think that's some stuff that we should just recognize, and that's something that this book does a fantastic job for strength coaches. Now, the second aspect around volume is that when volume increases in training, size and strength likely will also increase, in the sense that we're staying within that range of like 3 to 8 reps. So if we come in 1 week, and this is a method directly out of this book, that if we would come in for, let's say 2 weeks, and we do 2 sets of 5, okay, at a working weight of 80%. The next 2 weeks, if we do 4 sets of 5, we're increasing volume, and let's say we do 4 sets of 5 at 80% for 2 weeks. And then let's say 5th and 6th week, now we come in and we do 6 sets of 5 at 80%, we are increasing volume each week, and subsequently, very likely will also increase size and strength at the same time. That is very likely what's going to happen. Now, on page 34 of this book, you guys will see where some of the stuff, some of the rep schemes that you ask about is rooted. Okay, so oftentimes you'll all see comments, why do you use 7s? Who uses 7s? Page 34 of this book, 7 sets of 7. Old school training methods, old school rep schemes. And if you can think about my own influence on who influenced me the most, was my high school strength coach and my dad. These were old heads from the 60s and 70s. This book was written, I think it was written in like 1976 and then republished in 1981. The dude was probably writing this stuff in the early 70s, but it was all around simplicity. Okay, 7 sets of 7, one of the best ways to increase size and strength. And then finally, I believe on page 42, this author here gets into scraping the surface on mechanical tension. And I think that's one of the main reasons why Charles Poliquin loved this book, is that this dude was ahead of his time, okay? When he was talking about these different rep schemes and sets and stuff like that, it was groundbreaking stuff, but it was stuff that they were doing in the basement for hours and hours and hours on end. And I will be clear here is that a lot of this stuff, when I would train exactly like this, it might be a workout that takes 2 to 3 hours. And that was just what we would do for fun because we were just training in my garage. Okay, so page 42, they talk about mechanical tension, volume, intensity, and the cheating principle. So think about the cheating principle in doing something like a cheat curl or a heaving jerk almost, or a partial range of motion stuff, and just using body English to sort of get an overload on your muscles and then control that through the eccentric. So volume can be achieved using that cheating principle because of mechanical tension that will lead to greater strength. Now, the next thing, okay, I think one of the best aspects about the old school training methodology is based around comprehending movements and mindset. Movements. They didn't have Instagram. They didn't have somebody hanging bands with chains attached to the bands, attached to a bamboo bar, attached to a weight, attached to the ceiling that had a spinning fan. They didn't have that. They didn't have anything that could sort of be this hook or be this pattern interrupt on Instagram. Instead, what they had was they had to go based off of success. What works best? Compound movements work best. And you're looking at back squat, clean, snatch, deadlift, front squat, behind the neck press, bench press, incline bench, dips, bend over row, partial deadlifts, high pulls, shrugs. That's what everything was rooted in. Flies, lateral raises. That was literally all these dudes were doing. They would go in the basement and they'd freaking squat. They'd do high pulls. They'd do dips. They'd do lat pull downs. And that was it. They'd do 4 exercises for 7 sets of 10, 7 sets of 15, and just get freaking huge. Okay, so think about the simplicity and the value of compound movements when you're trying to increase strength. And oftentimes, as strength coaches, we sort of get away from that. We'll see a fancy movement, and some fancy movements are awesome, and we want to start using that more because it's interesting, it's something new. It's the woman in the red dress, but in reality, all it is a distraction. It's a distraction from those gains. Okay, the second part here, I talked about the mindset, right? And I think that this is rooted back in how much time does it take to achieve certain benchmarks. And the book actually does lay out like what should a grown man be able to do? They should be able to back squat 405. Which is pretty freaking strong. He should be able to bench press 300 plus weight pounds, which is pretty freaking strong. That's a really strong normal dude. Maybe a little too strong, but that's pretty freaking strong for a normal human being. But when we're talking about the tenacity and the mindset, one of the things that I love here is on page 48, where he says, to make gains, you need to master and increase training tenacity, dedication, not once, not twice, thrice fold. And I think that when I hear that, okay, I'm thinking immediately like there's a point of being a beginner or an intermediate athlete, but there's a point where to get to the next level, you've got to increase your tenacity. You've got to come in with more aggression. You got to come in with more purpose and logic to attack the weight with more intensity, and that will lead to bigger gains. Okay, I'm even envisioning someone like Dorian Yates just smashing weights over and over again at super high intensity. Another big factor in this book is that at the end of the book, he goes into specific bench specialization programs, deadlift specialization programs, squat specialization programs, and even into eating. And one of the things I'm going to share with you guys is in the back here, okay, where they get into eating, he'll talk about, okay, 1 cup of tomato juice, 1 can of corn niblets, sweet peas, carrots, pork and beans, a half pound of diced up ham, 1 cup of whole milk, 3 raw eggs. That's how they were eating back in the day to get freaking big, to get freaking strong. So again, some of the workouts for these specialization, they're very long, they're very hard, they're high volume. You gotta eat big if you're gonna do it. And it goes back to dips, close grip bench, flies, dumbbell incline work, all standard exercises that you guys will see inside of our strength training app, Peak Strength. And then finally, I wanna give this a huge nod before I release what book it is. My system of undulation is really rooted in this book. And I would make this argument that undulating system of periodization, like lifting heavy and then for speed or light, lifting heavy for speed or light, going back and forth, but even in a workout, having heavy sets like 4 sets of 5 and then 2 sets of 12, that's another form of undulation. I see it in the workout. I also see it in the entire system from a macro perspective. And it really roots in this book, and then it sort of gets affirmed by someone named Dietmar Schmidt-Bleicher with some of his research on undulating periodization. And then finally, I think one of the biggest powerlifting gyms in the entire world learned from this guy and coined and said that it was likely a Russian system. And I am not so sure that that's exactly how that story actually played out. I think there was more to this dude, and that's Anthony Datillo. And this book is called The Development of Physical Strength. And it's the book that every single strength coach needs if you want to be the best. And of course, if you guys want to help your athletes become absolute freaks, download Peak Strength, go in, select your sport, start training today, and increase that tenacity thrice-fold. Because remember, freaks, if you want to become a champion, you've always got to cultivate your power. Peace.